microphone.
Hey, May. Okay. You asked me about this design on my shirt. Back in 1684, some of our ancestors left France to come to Louisiana to find the mouth of the Mississippi River with the explorer La Salle. But they got terribly lost and ended up instead on the coast of Texas. In the process of this whole experiment, they left France with 4 ships, and as they were traveling towards America, one of the ships was captured by some Spanish pirates, so that left 3 ships. As they continued on to find the Mississippi River, they sailed next to the west side of Cuba and headed north towards the Mississippi River, but they got messed up somehow or another, and instead they ended up on the coast of Texas with the 3 ships. As soon as they entered Matagorda Bay, one of the ships ran aground and was lost. That meant that they only had 2 ships left. And of those 2 ships, one of the ships was a French military vessel. And its instructions were to bring La Salle and his colonists to Louisiana, which La Salle had already claimed for the King of France. Bring them to Louisiana, get them all set up, and then return to France. So eventually the military ship left and went back to France. So that left just 1 ship. And the 1 ship was called the Belle. And after about a year and a half or so, something like that, the whole French colony that La Salle had brought with him started to shrink because people died and everything. So after about a year and a half, the Belle went off on a expedition and it sunk. So that meant that the expedition was without any ships at all. So anyway, they tried to make the best of it, and the colony had kind of shrunk down to maybe about 50 or 60 people or something like that. They decided to try to build a fort, which they did in Texas at a place on something called Garcetas Creek. And they took some of the timbers from the ship that had sunk initially and tried to build the fort out of it. So they built the fort, and eventually La Salle said, we need to do something to go to get some help. So they said, okay, we're going to take about 25 people, we're going to start walking towards Canada to get help. And they did. And along the way, one of our uncles, Pierre Talon, he was with La Salle, and they were probably 200 miles or so from the coast, and there was a mutiny, and some of the guys killed La Salle. So he was assassinated, and meanwhile, our uncle Pierre Talon, he was a witness to that assassination. Anyway, back at the coast, the colony continued to shrink, and at some point, the Indians came and basically massacred everybody left at the fort, which was at that time just some crippled men, some women, some old priests, and so forth. But some of the kids they captured and they brought out to the wilderness with them. And eventually the Spaniards came to investigate the location of these Frenchmen, because the Spanish considered the entire Gulf Coast as part of Spanish territory. And when they heard that they were Frenchmen on their territory, they were really upset about it. So they sent out about 11 expeditions altogether to locate these Frenchmen. And eventually some of the Spaniards found the location of the fort, and when they did, they found, by that time the Indians had massacred people. But anyway, the Spaniards found the location of the fort, and on the wall of on one of the walls of the fort, someone had carved this design. And basically what it is, it's a cross, and there's like a heart, And in Latin it says the date from 1684 until 1680 blank. And this is the name of our ancestor, Robert Talon. Robert Talon had been born at sea in 1684 on the voyage over. And the explorer La Salle was his godfather. And that's why he got the name Robert, because he was named after his godfather. But anyway, the Spaniards found this design on the fort, and they had a notary with them. And the notary, he copied down the design in his official journal, and that was later on published. The image was later on published. So that's where this design comes from. There was something else too. Eventually, the Spanish came, and they learned about the kids who had been separated and went to different places with the various Indians. So the Spaniards wanted to go rescue the kids, which they did. And by this time, they had, I think, four or five Talon kids. They had Pierre Talon, Robert Talon, Lucien Talon, and Jean-Baptiste Talon. And if I mentioned Robert, and then his sister Madeleine. So anyway, they were the Talon kids, and they stayed with the Viceroy in Mexico. And the Viceroy was just like the King's representative in Mexico. So they stayed with the Viceroy for a number of years, and eventually the Viceroy retired and went back to Spain. And by this time, Robert was probably around 13 or so, but he went with the Viceroy. His older sister Madeleine, she went with the Viceroy. And meanwhile, the other three brothers, Lucien, Pierre, and Jean-Baptiste, they were old enough to be members of the Spanish Navy at the time. So they sailed out of Veracruz as members of the crew. Later on, at this time, Spain and France were at war with one another, and the French captured this Spanish ship. And as soon as they captured the Spanish ship, they realized that these three Talon brothers had been part of La Salle's expedition. And by that time, they were almost forgotten about. But still, the French wanted to know more about what was going on. So they brought them to the city of Brest in France, and they were interviewed. And when they were interviewed by the Frenchmen, they were able to compile a dictionary of Indian words in either Spanish or French or something like that. But anyway, they compiled a dictionary of Indian words, and they were very important because they had experience with the Indians. Right before they were interviewed, the explorer Iberville had just left to come down to find Louisiana, because he was going to fulfill what La Salle did not do. So Iberville had already left, and at that point they sent two of the Talon brothers on the next ship to Louisiana. That would have been Pierre and Jean-Baptiste. They came to Louisiana right after La Salle. And the other brother, Lucien, who was younger, he was too young to be part of the French Navy, so they sent him someplace, and I kind of lost track of him. But I kind of lost track of myself too.
And Robert, where did he want?
Oh yeah, okay. Anyway.
Also the tattoos and the self.
Okay. Wait. I lost my track.
Robert.
No.
Lucien.
Anyway, the two boys came over with Iberville, and this would have been about 1699. And about 3 years later, Iberville, who's in Louisiana, he gets a letter from somebody in France, and he said, the person in France writes, whatever happened to the three French boys? Do you know what happened to them? And Iberville wrote back, he says, I don't know where they are now, but the last thing that I heard was that they were in prisons in Portugal. And so when we made our trip to Lisbon several years ago, that was one of the things that we wanted to see. is the prison where they would have been. And to my estimation, that would have been probably the Torre de Belém in Lisbon. So that was kind of a significant thing for us as part of that same family. And one of the interesting episodes that happened in conjunction with that was that as we were touring the Tower of Belém, there were some French ladies there, and I remember that I had a copy of the letter that someone had written from France to Iberville about the being in prisons in Portugal. So I engaged these two ladies in French, which was kind of cool. I engaged them, and I told them about our family history. Then I showed them the letter, and they read over it and said, "Ooh la la!" So that was fun. But later on, Robert Talon, he spent some time in Europe, but eventually came to Louisiana, and he also became an explorer. While he was with the Indians, he had been tattooed like the Indians. He had tattoos on his face, hands, and back. And later on, when he came to Louisiana as a tattooed adult, he returned to the area around the Rio Grande River, and the old Spanish commandant who had been there early on, he recognized Robert Talon, and that was kind of an interesting thing too. So anyway, Robert Talon eventually goes back to Mobile, where he marries and has children. We descend from them. So it's been an amazing story. One of the other little episodes that I like to tell about is that as the group was walking towards Canada, they maybe had 25 people, and they wanted to leave. They wanted to bring whatever wealth that they had with them. And so as these people started killing one another, this wealth became concentrated because there were fewer people. And so eventually, Pierre Talon and one of the other kids at the time, they ended up with 80 golden louis d'or. That's golden louis. It's a coin. And so when the Spaniards came and rescued them, they said, "What do you have there, boy?" He said, "We have these things, whatever they were." And they passed them around, so all of a sudden it was, instead of 80 golden louis d'or, they only had 20 left. So I would suspect that somewhere in Mexico City, there may be a museum with some golden louis d'or coins that date from 1684 or earlier. So that would be one of the things I would like to explore. So anyway, that's about it. But it's a great story, and I made this design on this shirt, and it's available for our family of descendants if anybody wants one. All you have to do is let me know the size of the shirt, and we can pick it up from there.
Neat. Thank you.
Ta-da.